This 72 watt receiver is actually 13 watts. How does that work? Well, today we're going to take a look at this Pioneer SX-525 receiver from 1972 and do a couple quick and easy repairs. But also, we're mainly going to talk about why the ad copy math differs so much from the real world numbers and how they're able to arrive at those figures. Stick around, this is actually a lot more interesting than it sounds. So, first things first. As I said, this is a Pioneer SX-525. It's pretty close to the bottom of Pioneer's SX line of receivers from that era, and while it's still a pretty decent piece of equipment, all things considered, its lower specs are a good demonstration of marketing versus real-world performance numbers. And this one came in Pioneer's champagne color, so it looks nice too. Now before we get into the meat and potatoes, I promise I will show you the repairs that I did, but today, what I want to talk about is the listed specs, because if you're not familiar with all this stuff, this whole page is completely meaningless and all the specs that people throw around on forums and discussions aren't really helpful. So let's see if I can make a little bit of sense out of some of this stuff so that you at least kind of understand what everybody's talking about. I promise we're not going to do any math. Now, I'm not going to explain every single line on this page because we'd be here for hours, and most of it, as you'll start to realize, will become redundant or intuitive after you get the core idea. But let's start with power output since I mentioned it at the beginning and it's at the top of the page. The largest value at the top there is music power output. That's essentially a peak short burst power output rating. So it's momentary. I mean, we could potentially be talking about milliseconds without the amp burning itself out or causing damage. But that's not really a useful metric if it can only last a fraction of a second. What most listeners are concerned about is what the amplifier circuitry can safely handle continuously when actually driving a speaker to listen to something in their living space. The amp is rated at 13 watts per channel when actually hooked up to normal at the time home speakers and playing music or whatever you decide to listen to. They've also listed two other continuous power ratings, which just refer to lab tests where they fed in a single frequency sine wave that lets them find the output under ideal conditions, which, again, music absolutely isn't. So why does a receiver that has effectively 13 watts of usable power get advertised as having 72 watts in Pioneer's catalog? Well, for one thing, it's because it was made and sold before 1974. That's significant because in that year, the Federal Trade Commission enacted something called the amplifier rule, which specified a standardized uniform way to advertise the specs of consumer amplifiers or receivers like this one. In particular, the way power was measured to create a more honest and predictable basis for side-by-side comparisons. The new rule stated that power had to be measured under an 8 ohm load like your speakers would be, under the full frequency range of human hearing, 20 to 20,000 hertz, and with both the left and right channel connected at once. That's going to give a much lower standard figure, which they did actually provide in the service manual in this case. So if we look back at the other numbers, what you're actually seeing are carefully managed conditions that the testers engineered so the marketing department had inflated figures that they could print. It was common practice and wasn't technically lying, but it was arguably shady and deceptive at best, hence the 1974 law change. So when you see that rating of 72 watts, that was done with a lower resistance load than standard speakers and probably only lasted for a fraction of a second. And even punk rock bands don't do songs that are that short. So the useful number for anybody who's not in the weeds with this stuff is the 13 watt rating, because that's what relates to you actually continuously listening to Judas Priest on a Saturday afternoon. Looking back at the spec sheet, we see two more useful figures, harmonic and intermodulation distortion. Those are similar in concept, but produce very different results from our human perspective. Harmonic distortion is literally what it sounds like, harmonic. So if you feed in a single frequency, harmonic distortion would show up as multiples of that frequency that materialize out of the circuit. It's musical and subtly colors the sound. An exaggerated example would sound like this: clean, and then with harmonic distortion. Intermodulation distortion, on the other hand, is when multiple frequencies run through the amp at once and it generates tones that don't exist at all in the original audio signal. That makes a harsh, unpleasant, or fatiguing sound. It's a little harder to simulate on a keyboard, so I'm not going to insult your intelligence by trying, but needless to say, it's unpleasant. Now, as you can probably guess, neither of those things is ideal when you're listening to music. It's one thing if Kerry King distorts his guitars, it's another if your amp starts trying to do it too. So most engineers tried their best to keep the distortion as low as possible. But the existence of that distortion is also partially what contributes to old amps like this having their flavor and can be part of the listening experience for certain people who like specific pieces of equipment over others. Two things to take note of for this particular amp as well. They've indicated that the amplifier is actually built to handle speakers of 4, 8, and 16 ohm ratings. Not every amplifier is meant to be able to use speakers with impedances of anything other than 8 ohms. And that's pretty standard, but there are 4 and 16 ohm speakers out there that you may run across, and this receiver's amplifier circuitry can handle those. And just to be clear, this is a receiver. It has a radio in it, but when I say amp, I'm referring to the amplifier circuitry inside it. Also, they've specified the expected input voltage for your turntable. If you've watched my turntable videos, you're probably aware of this, but for those of you that haven't, I'll just say it again. Record players have 3 basic cartridge types. That's the part with the little stylus that touches the record and translates the grooves into an electrical signal. You have moving coil, moving magnet, and ceramic types. Each has a different output volume or voltage range. This phono preamp is expecting a moving magnet cartridge. A moving coil cartridge will be too quiet, and a ceramic cartridge will be way too loud and distort the signal and possibly even damage the preamp circuitry. Most of the rest of this stuff you can skip over because it's related to the voltages that send and receive signals from the satellite components like tape decks, antennas, microphones, and so on, and then internal signals which you yourself probably won't be interacting with. But there are 2 other specs worth noting. The first is the damping factor, and the second is what they're calling hum and noise, more commonly seen as a signal-to-noise ratio. The first one, the damping factor, is quite literally how much control the amp has over the physical mass of the speaker drivers themselves, especially heavy ones like the bass woofers. This is pretty intuitive, but unlike an electrical signal, the physical speaker cones, the coils, and the other pieces have inertia which doesn't immediately stop when a signal changes. The amp has to resist and compensate for that inertia, otherwise you get a looser, more muddy sound. It's like how I used to keep a big pillow in my bass drum so it sounded more punchy when I did double pedal rolls. Again, the damping factor contributes a little to the tonal flavor of your receiver or amplifier. A higher number is more damping. The last thing is that hum and noise spec I pointed out. That's a measurement of the relative loudness of the actual audio signal to the background hum of the power supply, the circuitry noise, or that kind of thing. The higher that number, the quieter and less noticeable the noise is. The only caveat with that spec is it's going to depend a lot on the condition of the internal components like filter capacitors, which degrade over time. So the specs listed on the sheet are probably not going to perfectly reflect the real-world experience of an unrestored 50-year-old receiver. With that out of the way, let's look at this thing. It needed a few really basic repairs. Nothing you couldn't do with a couple screwdrivers, a digital multimeter, a soldering iron, and a little bit of patience. It was just light bulb changes. And if it weren't for this one here, it would have just been a 10 minutes in a screwdriver situation. Now about half the bulbs in the radio dial were burned out and the FM selector light was out. The dial bulbs are standard T2 fuse lamps. They're light bulbs that look just like fuses. Which one's the fuse again? Right, this one. I was able to buy these for cheap from Parts Express. The other bulb, however, was a little grain of wheat bulb, and the only place I could find these was from a seller on eBay. And changing it required a few more tools, but it certainly wasn't hard, and I'm confident any of you watching would have no trouble doing this yourselves at home. The shell comes off with these 4 screws. Solid wood, not bad. Then you want to get the faceplate off. There are 2 screws on the top, which have definitely been replaced, and then hidden under the knobs are some 12mm nuts. That gets the faceplate off. Then this little plate comes off, just 3 screws. Now this is the trickiest part. I recommend wearing gloves so you don't get fingerprints on the dial. There are 5 screws across the top. You want to very carefully remove those without scratching or scuffing the black paint on the dial. Then, before you remove the acrylic plate, spin the tuner so the needle is all the way to the right. Then slide the dial out like this, carefully. That reveals the light bulbs. You can see that some of them aren't working. There should be 5 glowing instead of 3. We're just going to pull all 5 of them out. Now you'll note, these have little shiny reflectors on them. Lamps like this don't normally come like that. Pioneer added these in when they installed them. So I'm going to do the same. I have some high temp aluminum HVAC tape, which I'm just going to cut and apply to the bulbs. Make sure you use a tape that can handle high temperatures. Then I just pop them into each of the sockets, making sure the reflector tape is to the back. Easy. This took less than 10 minutes start to finish. Now, let's look at that other bulb. To get access to it, you also have to remove this little plate, which is just these 2 screws. You can just loosen them and slide the plate out so you don't have to keep track of the screws. Then the bulb had to be carefully unglued and desoldered. That's also easy. Getting the new one to stay in the socket took some doing though. I actually ended up using the same aluminum tape to get it to sit nice and centered and then just glued it again just to keep it secure. That's better. It's a little brighter, but you can't tell with the faceplate on. Now, remember I said I needed a digital multimeter? Well, that's not strictly true just to replace the bulb. The multimeter was necessary because the service manual doesn't specify the voltage of the bulb, and if you get the wrong one, it'll either be way too dim or it can overdrive the bulb and burn it out right away. To figure out the voltage, you just clip the multimeter to the 2 terminals where the bulb attaches, turn the receiver on, and switch to FM. Set the multimeter voltage to take a reading. Let's pretend you don't know if it's AC or DC. When you take your reading, it should look like a mostly stable voltage somewhere between 1 and 12 volts. If it's not and you get weird results, you're on the wrong setting. Just switch it. A normal result will correspond with the type of power, AC or DC. You can use the voltage reading to figure out the correct type of lamp to order. These bulbs don't come in every imaginable voltage. They're made only in a few standard voltages. 1.5, 6.3, 8, and 12 volts are probably the most common. At least that's what I saw when I looked them up. The current rating, from what I've found, tends to be roughly the same on most of the bulbs that you'll find for this type of gear. So if you look at the reading that I got, it hovers around 7.9 volts. That's very close to 8. And those are usually 50 to 60 milliamps. So that gives us these guys that I found on eBay in bundles of a lot. I also highly recommend buying the bulbs that already have the insulated wire leads attached to them. The ones without are a much bigger pain in the butt to work with, and it takes a lot longer to install them because you have to attach the wires, wrap them in protective heat-proof insulation, and so on. Nobody wants to do that if they can help it. But now, it all works. So we just have to put everything back together in reverse order, and we will have a working receiver. This plate, the dial, carefully, this other little bracket, then the faceplate, the nuts, the top screws, the knobs, which I ran through the ultrasonic and scrubbed with a toothbrush because they were disgusting, and finally the cover. The last step was to do a bit of cleaning. This came from the same house as the American Acoustics Lab speakers from my last video, which means it was dirty. So I washed everything up as best I could, vacuumed out the interior, which I'm sorry I forgot to film, and then cleaned and polished the wood shell. Very pretty. I'm sorry, this video is already running long, so I'm going to cut it off here and come back for part 2, where we'll take a look at the amp itself, what it does, and all the features and gizmos. So I'll see you guys again in part 2, and until then, Slayer.